Sarah had just started working as a flight attendant and was eager to impress her seniors on this busy international flight. The plane was filled with the usual mix of passengers. Some were eager to get to their destinations, others were anxious and restless. But none of them bothered her like the elderly man in seat 22. He was one of those passengers who seemed to demand more than he needed with every glance he gave her. She felt the weight of his eyes lingering on her, as if he expected something that no one else did, something she hadn't even noticed about him yet. But it bothered her she couldn't explain why he was just another old man on a long flight. But there was something about his slow, deliberate movements, the way he clasped his hands together so tightly, that made her uneasy. She decided to avoid him, for now focusing on the other passengers, who seemed much easier to deal with, the ones who had clear requests and demands. She could handle those, but this man was different. There was a quiet intensity to him that Sarah wasn't prepared for. The flight went on, and Sarah tried to keep herself busy. The crew was short-staffed, and her responsibilities were mounting. As she passed by seat 22, again, she noticed the man had fallen asleep, his wrinkled face tilted toward the window, his hands still folded neatly in his lap. But there was something unsettling about the way his eyes were closed too tightly, like he was holding on to some memory that he didn't want to let go of. Maybe it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't like the other passengers. There was something about him that felt almost out of place, but she told herself it was just the nerves of her first long-haul flight, and moved on. It wasn't until much later that Sarah had her first real interaction with him. The cabin lights dimmed and passengers settled in for the night. Sarah was making her rounds, handing out blankets and drinks, when the man in 22, astirred, he opened his eyes slowly and looked at her with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through her. Something about the way he watched her made her pause for a split second, and in that moment Sarah felt the strange unease return again. It was as though he knew something about her that she didn't know herself, but she quickly pushed the thought aside, focusing on her jaw. He looked up at her and spoke in a soft voice. "Excuse me, miss, could I get a blanket, please?" Sarah nodded quickly. Without thinking, "Just a minute," she said, and moved on to the next aisle. The words left her mouth without much thought, but as soon as she said them, she could feel a tightness in her chest, as if the old man's request had triggered something deep within her. She didn't know why she felt that way. All she wanted was to get through the flight without any issues, and there were plenty of other passengers to attend to, so why was he bothering her now? But before she could walk away, she heard his voice again. "Miss, could I please get that blanket?" It was softer this time, but there was an edge to it, like a plea, or maybe even a quiet demand. Sarah felt a sudden spike of irritation rising inside her. It wasn't even the man's request that bothered her. It was the way he asked for it, like he had every right to expect her to serve him right then and there, after all the others had been waiting patiently. She shot him a brief look. "You'll have to wait like everyone else," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. But she quickly turned away and walked down the aisle, pretending to be busy with other tasks. She could hear him mumble something under his breath, but she ignored it, trying to focus on the others. But a nagging feeling wouldn't leave her mind. Something about him felt wrong, like he was waiting for something to happen, and Sarah couldn't shake the sense that she had just crossed a line with him that she wouldn't be able to undo. Sarah tried to shake off the unease that had settled in her stomach, but the rest of the flight felt different somehow every time she passed seat 22, as she couldn't help but glance over at the old man, who still sat there watching her with that unsettling calm. His eyes seemed to follow her every move, and no matter how much she tried to focus on the other passengers, it was as though he was always there in the corner of her mind. His presence felt like an unspoken challenge, one she wasn't sure how to face, or even why she should have to. It didn't make sense, she told herself. He was just another passenger, but something about him made her skin crawl. She kept telling herself she was overreacting, that it was all in her head, but the feeling didn't go away. The cabin was dim now as the flight stretched on, and passengers began to settle in for the night. Sarah continued with her duties, quietly checking on the others, adjusting blankets, and offering drinks to those who requested them. But her mind kept drifting back to 22A, and the man who sat there, his eyes never left her. Even when he seemed to doze off again, he had a way of being fully still that seemed unnatural, like he was holding himself back, waiting for something to happen. Or perhaps he was just waiting for her to notice him, to acknowledge him in some way that she wasn't ready to offer. A few hours into the flight, Sarah found herself standing by the galley trying to distract herself with a cup of coffee. She needed a moment to breathe. The weight of the flight was starting to catch up with her. But as she stared into the dark cabin, she couldn't escape the thought of the man. She had been rude to something deep inside her told her it wasn't just about the blanket that he wanted from her. It felt like he was testing her in some way, but for what reason she didn't know. It wasn't until Sarah returned to the main cabin that she had another encounter with him. She was passing through the aisles, checking on the rows, when she caught his gaze once again. This time it was even more intense than before. She felt his eyes on her, like a quiet pressure pushing down on her shoulders. And as she moved past him, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, miss, can you help me with the overhead compartment?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, not sure if she had heard him right. He hadn't asked for anything else since his initial request for the blanket, but now he wanted help with the compartment in a voice so calm it almost sounded too composed. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing up at him. "I'll get to it in a minute." But something in his tone made her stop short. There was no irritation, no urgency, just an overwhelming sense of patience, but also a subtle expectation in his words. It unsettled her even more. She quickly moved to help. But as she opened the compartment, she couldn't shake the thought that this man wasn't like the others. He was different, and she couldn't figure out why. As Sarah returned to her duties, she couldn't help but feel more and more on edge. She had dealt with countless passengers in her short time as a flight attendant, but none of them had made her feel this way. None of them had quietly observed her with such intense focus. And she began to wonder if maybe she had misjudged him, if there was something about him that she hadn't noticed before, something beneath the surface that she couldn't put her finger on. But every time she tried to dismiss the thoughts, they came rushing back stronger than before. Finally, when the plane began its descent, Sarah's stomach twisted in knots. The flight was nearly over, but the unease still lingered. She felt an unfamiliar sense of guilt, a nagging feeling that she hadn't done enough for this man, that maybe she had missed something important. And as the captain's voice came through the intercom, thanking passengers for their cooperation and reminding them to stay seated, she couldn't help but wonder if this was all just a coincidence, or if she was about to learn something far more significant than she could have ever imagined. Sarah tried to focus on her duties, but every time she passed seat 22, the man's gaze followed her. His eyes never left her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her in a way that felt different from any other passenger. It wasn't the kind of glance people gave when they wanted something. It was something deeper, a quiet intensity that made her skin crawl. She began to feel like she was under some sort of unspoken pressure, like the man was waiting for her to do something, to say something. But she couldn't understand what it was that he wanted from her, why she felt so uneasy every time she looked at him. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself that it was just her nerves, that he was simply another old man on a long flight. But the more she tried to ignore him, the more his presence seemed to grow more pronounced, like the space around her was filled with his quiet expectations. Sarah couldn't concentrate on anything else. Every movement felt calculated, like he was studying her in ways she didn't understand. It wasn't just the way he watched her that unsettled her. It was the way he seemed so completely still, so controlled, as if he had the patience of someone who had lived through a lifetime of waiting, like nothing in the world could disturb his peace. And yet he never spoke unless spoken to, And even then his voice was so soft, it almost felt like he was trying not to disturb the air around him. His presence was an odd combination of calm and tension, and it made Sarah feel like she was walking a thin line. When the flight attendants began preparing for descent, Sarah was asked to do one last check of the cabin to ensure everything was secure as she walked down the aisles, making sure passengers were ready for landing. Her eyes kept drifting back to seat 22. The man was still there, his posture as rigid as before, his eyes still following her every step, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. She felt his gaze so clearly, it was like a weight pressing against her chest, but she couldn't stop herself from looking back at him. She had never been one to feel intimidated by passengers, but there was something about this man that broke all her usual instincts. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't loud or demanding, yet somehow she felt like he was more powerful than anyone else on the flight, more imposing even in his silence than any angry or upset traveler she had ever encountered. As Sarah turned down the last aisle, she found herself standing next to seat 22. And once again, she had nowhere else to go. And as she glanced down, she noticed the man was no longer looking at her with quiet observation. Instead, his gaze was fixed, straight ahead, his expression unreadable. But there was something about him, something in the way he sat that told Sarah something was different now. He wasn't just a weary traveler who wanted a blanket or help with his compartment. He was a man with a history, one that she didn't know, and one that perhaps she wasn't prepared to understand. But somehow deep down she knew this wasn't a coincidence. She wasn't just dealing with another old man who needed help with trivial things. This man had a presence that transcended the ordinary. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she turned to walk away, but before she could take another step, she heard his voice. It was quiet, but carried a weight that stopped her in her tracks. "Miss." She froze, her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to speak again. But now that he had, it was like everything in the air had changed. He wasn't asking for anything now. There was no request, no demand, just the quiet power of his voice, making her feel like she had no choice but to turn around. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper, her voice shaky, even though she tried to sound confident. He spoke again, this time, his tone softer, but filled with an unexpected gravity. "Could you sit with me for a moment?" Sarah was taken aback. She didn't know what to say. His request was simple enough, but the way he asked it felt as if it held some deeper meaning, as though he wasn't just asking for company, but for something more, something important. And Sarah couldn't help but feel that she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite understand yet. But whatever it was pulling her in closer and closer with every passing second. Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing, as she tried to make sense of what he had just asked. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to say anything at all. She had assumed he would remain the same silent figure that had made her uncomfortable for the past several hours. But now he was asking for her to sit with him. It wasn't just a request. It was a quiet command, wrapped in a calm but undeniable presence. She didn't know what to do, or how to respond. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her instincts screamed at her to walk away, to pretend she hadn't hurt him. But there was something about the way he spoke, something that made her feel as if walking away would be the wrong choice. She turned slowly and looked at him, her eyes meeting his for what felt like the first time. His gaze was no longer unsettling in the same way it had been before. It wasn't cold or calculating. It wasn't filled with anger or frustration. It was simply calm, deep, almost as if he had seen everything there was to see in the world and had come to a place where nothing could faze him any more. It was a look of understanding, a look that felt as though he was waiting for her to realize something she hadn't yet figured out. He smiled at her softly, a slight curl of his lips that felt so out of place on a man who looked like he had lived through so much. But it wasn't a smile of kindness or warmth. It was something more. It was a smile that spoke of experience, that spoke of stories left untold, of sacrifices made and battles fought. And somehow she knew in that moment that she was dealing with someone far more important than she had ever imagined. Sarah's breath hitched as she hesitated for a moment. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken weight of the request hanging between them, but she couldn't bring herself to say no, not yet. She had to know why he had asked her, why he had singled her out. When there were so many others around, she slowly sat down in the seat beside him, trying to calm the nerves that were beginning to take over her body. She could feel the cool air around her and the soft hum of the plane's engines in the background. But in that moment, it felt as though everything else faded into the distance. It was just the two of them in that small space, locked in a strange kind of silence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was as though he was giving her time to adjust to the reality of what had just happened, to the shift in the air around them. He was patient and still, and Sarah felt her heart rate begin to slow as she sat there in the quiet. She wasn't sure what she expected from him, but she knew that she couldn't leave now. She had to understand what he wanted from her. What was it about her that had drawn his attention? What was it that had made him ask for her company after so many hours of being invisible to her? Finally, the silence was broken when the man spoke again, his voice soft, but filled with an authority that Sarah hadn't expected. "I know you've been avoiding me all night." He said it so casually, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, but the words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her mouth went dry, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. She had been avoiding him. But how did he know that? How could he possibly know what had been going on in her mind? He seemed to sense her confusion and smiled again, though this time the smile was tinged with something deeper, something that made her feel both small and seen at the same time. "I could tell," he said simply. "I've seen that look in a lot of people's eyes over the years." Sarah's pulse quickened. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of meaning, but she still didn't understand. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She tried again, but still nothing, only the pounding of her heart in her ears. He didn't seem to mind, his gaze never leaving hers as he spoke again. "You're wondering who I am, aren't you?" His voice was low, but there was no malice in it, just a quiet understanding that seemed to draw her in further. Sarah nodded slightly, her throat tight, as she finally managed to whisper, "Yes, I am." He gave her a long look before speaking again, his words deliberate and measured. "You don't need to know my name to understand that every person on this plane has a story, and sometimes those stories aren't what they seem." It was then that Sarah felt at the realization that she had been part of something much bigger than she could have imagined, that she was about to learn something about this man, something that would change everything she thought she knew about him, and perhaps even about herself. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, trying to process the weight of the man's words. They hung in the air like a thick fog, filling the space between them. But she couldn't grasp what he meant. He hadn't told her his name. He hadn't said anything about his life. And yet he spoke as if she should understand everything he was trying to say. But what story was he talking about? What was it that had drawn him to her in the first place? She wanted to ask more questions, but something about his presence stopped her. It wasn't fear, but a strange reverence, as though every word he spoke carried more weight than she was ready to handle. She felt like a child again, being handed a puzzle she wasn't old enough to solve yet. Her throat tightened as she searched for something to say, something that would make sense of everything happening right now. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself staring at him, still trying to figure out who this man was, how he had come to sit beside her, and why he had asked her of all people to listen. After a moment of silence, he spoke again, his voice softer now, but still carrying the same weight. "I can see you're trying to figure me out, but sometimes things aren't meant to be figured out right away." Sarah nodded slowly, even though she didn't fully understand. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. There was something about him that was beyond comprehension, something that felt timeless. and perhaps a little out of reach. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but none of them had made her feel this way. This man was different, in ways she couldn't explain, but his quiet certainty made her feel like she was standing at the edge of the great unknown. "You've been curious all night, haven't you?" he continued, "about why I was looking at you while I haven't let you forget about me. But the truth is I wasn't watching you, I was watching myself." The words hit Sarah like a jolt. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, but his gaze was far away, lost in memories that weren't hers. His eyes were distant, like he was staring into something far beyond the cabin walls. She didn't know what he meant, but the idea of him watching himself unsettled her more than anything he had said so far. "You see," he went on, "we all have stories hidden deep inside of us. We all carry things with us that we don't show to the world. It's easier to keep it all locked away, to let others see what we want them to see, but the truth is those hidden things shape who we are." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. She had heard stories like this before, stories of people with hidden pasts, people who carried pain or guilt or regret. But she had never felt this close to one of them before. She had never felt like she was sitting beside someone who had lived through something so much bigger than herself. "The truth is," he continued, "I've seen things that no one should ever have to see, but I've also learned things that most people would never believe. I've had to carry a lot of weight in my life, and some of it is too heavy to share with just anyone. But there are moments in life when you meet someone and you feel like maybe that person needs to know just a little bit of your story, even if it's only for a few minutes." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she absorbed his words. Something inside her shifted. She couldn't explain it, but the heaviness in her chest seemed to lighten just a little, as if the world around them was suddenly less confined and more open. She had been so focused on getting through this flight, doing her job, and keeping things in order that she had never stopped to think about the people she was serving, the stories they carried with them, the struggles and triumphs they hid behind polite smiles and brief conversations. She realized then that this wasn't just about a blanket or a seat or a simple request. This man was offering her something far more valuable than anything she could have imagined. He was offering her a glimpse into the depth of human experience, into a life that had been lived fully, but also with great pain and loss. She felt a sudden urge to reach out to him, to ask more questions, to understand everything that had led him to this moment. But before she could speak again, he silenced her with one final statement. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is sit in silence and listen," he said. "But if you can learn to do that, you'll learn more than any words can ever teach you." And with that, the cabin seemed to hold its breath as the plane continued its descent into the unknown. Sarah sat there frozen in silence, her mind racing, but unable to form the words to respond to him. His statement hung in the air, and with each passing second, the weight of it seemed to grow heavier. It wasn't just his words, but the quietness of the moment. Everything around them faded, as if the plane itself had taken a breath and held it. Sarah felt like she was waiting for something she didn't understand, like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. But she didn't know what to say or what to do. The old man beside her had opened a door, but she had no idea what was on the other side. She had been thinking about the job, the flight, the next steps. But now it all seemed insignificant compared to the man sitting beside her. His calm presence seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the plane, beyond time itself, and Sarah couldn't figure out why she was so deeply drawn to him, why she felt like she needed to know more, like she had to understand what had made him speak with such authority about life, pain, and hidden stories. She finally managed to speak, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you mean by all of this." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply looked at her as if waiting for her to figure it out for herself. His gaze was steady and kind, but there was something behind it, something that made Sarah feel like she was on the brink of discovering something she wasn't ready for. After a long pause, he spoke again, this time his voice slower, almost deliberate. Sometimes we walk through life thinking we have it all figured out. We build walls around ourselves to protect us from what we fear, but in the end, those walls only trap us inside. Sarah felt the words like a cold wind against her skin. They cut deeper than she expected, as though he had somehow seen straight through her, not just to her fears, but to her very soul. She had always thought of herself as someone who had a handle on life, someone who could stay calm and collected no matter what, but now she felt vulnerable, exposed, like she had been standing on shaky ground all this time and had never even realized it. "You've built your own walls," he continued. "You don't even realize it, but I can see them every time you avoid me, every time you try to push me away, like you've done since the beginning of the flight." Sarah blinked rapidly. She hadn't realized it, but he was right. She had been avoiding him the whole time. From the moment she had seen him sitting in his seat, his eyes watching her, she had kept him at arm's length. And now here he was breaking down all the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. She didn't know how to respond, or even if she should respond, but the words seemed to flow out of her before she could stop them. "I wasn't avoiding you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just didn't know how to deal with you." He smiled gently, as if he had been waiting for her to say that. There's nothing wrong with not knowing how to deal with someone. Sometimes the most difficult thing is simply to accept that we don't have all the answers, that we don't always know what's coming next. But the moment you can accept that, you'll find peace in the uncertainty. Sarah's chest tightened. She had never thought of life in those terms. Before, she had always tried to have a plan, to be prepared to know what would happen next. But now she was realizing that perhaps the constant need for control was what had kept her from truly living. She had been so focused on keeping everything in order that she hadn't allowed herself the space to breathe, to let go of the fear of the unknown. She was silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She looked out the window at the night sky, the stars sparkling like distant points of light in an endless sea of darkness. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel afraid of what was coming next. She didn't feel like she needed to have everything figured out. All she had to do was sit there and listen. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is simply listen," he repeated quietly, as if he could sense her thoughts. "But if you can do that, if you can truly listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart, you'll start to see the world in a way you never thought possible." Sarah felt a shift within her, a sense of calm spreading from the center of her chest outward. She wasn't sure what the next step would be, but for the first time in a long while she felt ready to embrace the unknown. As the plane continued its descent into the night, Sarah sat there beside the old man, no longer trying to figure him out or understand everything about him, but simply listening, letting the silence settle around them like a gentle companion. As the plane began its final descent, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside of her. It was subtle but undeniable. It was as if the veteran's words had begun to seep into her very being, transforming the way she viewed the world and herself. She sat there in silence beside him, her thoughts swirling, but for the first time all night, she wasn't afraid of the uncertainty she had been so obsessed with before. Instead, she felt a strange sense of peace, a calm that she hadn't known in years. And the longer she sat there, the more she realized that this moment was something she would never forget. The man beside her seemed to sense her shift, and for a moment he was quiet too, his gaze focused on the horizon, his face unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, a depth that spoke of a lifetime of experiences, a lifetime of battles, both seen and unseen. And Sarah couldn't help but wonder just how much he had endured, how many things he had seen that had shaped him into the person he was today. She had only been a flight attendant for a few years, but in that time she had met hundreds of passengers, each with their own stories, but none had made her feel like this. None had left her questioning her own life. The way this man had, she felt like she had been looking at the world through a fogged window all this time, but now it was as if the glass had been wiped clean, and she could see everything clearly for the first time. As the plane's wheels hit the runway and the lights of the city below came into view, Sarah knew that their brief encounter was coming to an end. The plane was almost on the ground, and soon the veteran would disembark along with the other passengers. But before that happened, he turned to her one last time, his expression softer than before. "You're not the same person you were when you boarded this flight," he said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. Sarah looked at him, surprised by the intensity of his statement. But she didn't know how to respond. She hadn't even realized how much she had changed over the course of the flight. But now that he had pointed it out, she could feel it too. She was different. She was no longer the same woman who had been focused on her job and her routines, who had spent so much time hiding behind walls of control and fear. Now she was someone who was starting to embrace the unknown, someone who was ready to listen and accept the world as it came to her. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words seemed so simple, but they carried all the gratitude she couldn't express in any other way. She didn't know how to thank him for what he had given her, how to express the way he had opened her eyes to things she hadn't been able to see before. He smiled that same quiet smile, a smile that held more wisdom than she could ever hope to understand, and nodded as if he knew exactly what she meant. "You'll understand more in time," he said. And she could hear the finality in his words. The plane slowed to a stop, and the captain's voice came through the intercom, announcing that they had arrived safely at their destination. The passengers began to gather their things, preparing to exit, but Sarah remained seated for a moment. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of this brief connection, this fleeting moment of clarity. But she knew that it was time to move forward. She stood up slowly, feeling a sense of gratitude that she had never felt before. As she walked down the aisle, she glanced at seat 22, one last time. But the man was already gone. She couldn't help but feel a sense of loss as she walked past his empty seat, but also a sense of hope, as though his presence had left something behind, something that would stay with her long after the flight was over. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt ready to face whatever came next, no matter how uncertain or unknown it was. As Sarah walked down the jet bridge towards the airport terminal, she felt the familiar rush of the crowd around her, people hurrying to their destinations, completely unaware of the quiet change that had taken place inside of her for the first time in what felt like forever. She wasn't thinking about the next task, or the next flight, or the countless things she had to do in her life. She wasn't looking ahead with anxiety or worry. She was simply present. She was there in the moment, letting it wash over her, without trying to control or predict what would happen next. She walked through the terminal, almost in a daze, her mind still replaying the conversation with the veteran over and over again, like an old song that she couldn't stop hearing. His words echoed in her thoughts, reminding her that she didn't have to have all the answers, that she didn't need to be in control all the time, that sometimes the most important thing was to listen to what life was telling her, to accept the uncertainty and let go of the fear that had held her captive for so long. She wasn't sure why, but as she moved through the crowd, she found herself looking for him, looking for the man who had changed everything for her. She had expected him to disappear into the sea of faces, as so many passengers did. But something told her that this was different. Something told her that he wasn't just another passenger passing through her life. He had left a mark on her soul, something that would stay with her long after he was gone. She didn't see him at first as she walked past the rows of gates and the shops lining the terminal, but then she spotted him standing by the exit door, his back straight, his posture regal. Even in his old age, he wasn't looking at her, but she felt his presence like a beacon pulling her toward him. She didn't know why, but she found herself walking towards him almost without thinking. When she reached him, he turned his head, slightly acknowledging her presence with a slight nod, but he didn't say anything at first. Sarah stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then the words came out of her mouth before she could stop them. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with sincerity. "I don't know how to explain it, but you've helped me more than you know." He didn't respond right away. He simply looked at her with those deep eyes that seemed to see right through her, and for a moment it felt like he was looking at something far beyond her. The weight of his gaze seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 stories and experiences. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't feel the need to understand it all or make sense of it. She was simply thankful. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice soft but sure. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I'm just another person on this journey, just like you. But what you do with what you've learned, that's what matters." The words hung between them in the air, and for a brief moment Sarah understood exactly what he meant. It wasn't about the past, or the struggles, or the battles we fought. It was about how we carried those experiences with us, how we chose to live in the present, and how we chose to move forward. She nodded slowly, her heart full of gratitude, and something else, something deeper, that she couldn't quite name. She wasn't the same person she had been when she had boarded that flight, and she realized that the veteran had given her something she couldn't repay, a gift that would shape her for the rest of her life. He smiled that same quiet smile, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking, and with that he turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the crowd. But this time Sarah didn't feel any sense of loss or emptiness. Instead, she felt like she had been given a gift that she could carry with her wherever she went, a gift that didn't require understanding or explanation, just the simple act of being present and embracing the unknown. As she watched him disappear into the crowd, she took a deep breath and smiled to herself. For the first time in a long time, she was ready to face whatever came next.